In this exercise we are going to rig and then animate these doors. So before we start, just a little bit of mesh prep or a summary of our mesh prep. So these doors are actually inverted in the sense that the pivot point is just located at the center point or the center of Blender Grid, because that is the point around which the meshes rotate as objects. So they look as though they're inverted, but actually what they should be is that. But because this is a left and a right side, and the pivot points are set up appropriately, in order to add the rig and then animate it, we have to position the objects relative to grid center before we drop in the armature that we'll use for the animation. So that's point one. Point two, I'm just going to solid mode to make this easy to see. The hinges have also been set up relative to that pivot point. So there's a line, a vertical line, drawn down through the hinges. So we want view, viewpoint, top. So there are the hinges, and they are located approximately on the object's pivot point, which is where the widget currently is. So that's our point of rotation. So visually we have a pivot point that makes sense relative to the object. So that's point two. And then point three, we want to animate the handles. So there are two, one on either side, and we have to think about how these will animate together as a unit. And based on the way that the mesh has been made, some adjustment might need to be made to that, which we'll do when we get to that point of animation, because this is a single unified section of the mesh, and we need this to rotate independently of the back. And in order to do that, we have to separate the two from one another, which means making some adjustments to the mesh. So we'll do that later on. But that is something that we need to be aware of when we do things like this, is that we might have to adjust the mesh at some point during rigging and or animation. So that's point three. So those are the main things that we want to consider. So to animate this object, all it's going to do is rotate, and then we'll have the handles doing a little animation. When we look at our object, we're going to need a bone at the pivot point, a bone that acts as a rotational point for the door knocker, and then maybe another bone that controls the handle, so that can rock back and forth. So we'll have three bones. So there's the bone at the pivot, the bone that controls the spindle, and then the bone on either side that controls the actual metal knocker. We've got everything set up in terms of how the mesh should be structured. We've got it positioned at 0, 0, 0 grid center. So we'll just make sure 3D cursor, make sure that's at grid center, 0, 0, 0, because when we add the armature, it will be added at the location of the cursor, and we want that to be located at the pivot point just to make this whole process easy. We don't want to be moving things around too much. So we've got our object zeroed, item, and we've got the cursor zeroed out. So all we need to do now is add armature, that will drop in an armature with a single bone. Let's go into wireframe so that we can see it. We can make it bigger if we want. We have to be in edit mode anyway, so make sure that's selected. Object mode, edit mode, select the top sphere. It is selected, and we'll use our widgets to manipulate it. Hold Control, snap to the grid. This just makes it bigger and easier to see. So we'll need 3 bones, as we said. So we've got our pivot. So we need to duplicate this to create the spindle, and then we'll duplicate again to create the handles. So select, Armature, duplicate. That will duplicate the bone. Escape to reset. And this time the bone is selected, or the bone is highlighted, so we can move that with our widget tools. So we'll move that, hold Control, snap to the grid, although we might need to use some increments. Change our perspective, viewpoint front. Position that roughly. So that's going to be the pivot point of the spindle for the handles. So we can do 2 things to rotate the bone. We can either select the top sphere and just drag that down, and it rotates relative to the root of the bone, but we need to be in a fixed view to make sure that that is precise in terms of its position, because if we just free move it the way that we did, it'll go off kilter, or it has a tendency to go off kilter. So let's just undo that, Control Z. So alternatively, what we can do, select the bone, then use the rotate widget, rotate the entire bone. So hold Control to snap to the grid, and that's the bone rotated. Move that into position. Tail. Head. So we're positioning these, the head and the tail, at the pivot point of the handle. So we'll do that again, duplicate, or alternatively what we could do is extrude. So Armature extrude. So if we select the tailbone, Armature extrude, so that's the E key, or we can use extrude tool in the toolbar. That'll give us this little widget. View, right, fix our perspective, hold Control so that we're snapping to the grid. Then we can repeat on both sides. So ordinarily, we don't want to necessarily extrude a bone from the root of a bone. We want this chain. But in this particular situation, this is okay because this is going to be parented to this bone, and all this does is just rotate. So it pivots. So all that's going to do is rotate that way. And these 2 knocker bones, the bones for the handles, those will move with this one. So once we get the relationship set up, that's how that will work. We don't have to worry too much about this setup, where we're essentially inverting the bone relationship. So those are our bones. We need to create a relationship between all of them now. So we want these 2 linked to this, and then this one linked to this. And what that does is it creates a hierarchy where when this bone swivels, it'll carry these with it, and then when this bone swivels, it'll carry these bones with it. So we can check the relationships. We're in edit mode. So we want to be in bone properties. So select the bone, relations, and here we have parent. We want this to be this bone. So before we do that, let's just rename these. So handle 1, handle 2, spinner or axle, and then hinge. Let's check our setup in the outliner. So right now we've got handle 2 automatically has a relationship to this bone, to the axle. So we want to select handle 1, click on the bone icon, select axle. So we might be able to see, let's just hide. So there's a dashed line that's appeared that means that there's a relationship between this bone and this bone now. So let's just double check. Axle, handle 1, axle. So now we select axle and link that to the hinge. So again, bone list, hinge, and there we can see our dotted line confirming the relationship. So what this means is that if we drop out of edit mode, go into pose mode, we can check the relationships between the bones by selecting each in turn, pressing the R key, and we have the hinge controlling the handles and the axle controlling the 2 handles, and the handles moving independently on their own. So the relationship is root to axle to handle to handle. So that's the basic structure of our armature. Let's go back into object mode. So that's the basic skeleton. We now need to attach that to the mesh. Let's switch back to solid mode. So the way that we do this, we select our mesh and we have to create vertex groups. So in object data, we have this section, vertex groups. What we're going to do is create a named group or group of named groups that correspond to the bits of the mesh that we want to control. So the first and most obvious is just the hinge. So we need a group that carries a corresponding name to the hinge bone. So we're going to apply that to the entire mesh. So we can either set the groups up and then assign them, or create the groups and assign them as we need them. So for the sake of clarity, we're going to create all the groups carrying the names of the bones. So click on the plus button and we're going to use a skeleton as our reference. So we've got a group, double click, we'll call this hinge. Click the plus button again, call this axle, and again handle 1, and again handle 2, double click. So those are our groups, and they as mentioned, they correspond to the armature's bone names, or the individual bones within the armature. So, select the mesh, edit mode, select all, and we're just going to assign all the mesh to hinge. And this will just show, it'll highlight what we're actually doing. So select hinge, click assign, and that has now assigned the vertices of the mesh to that group, which then is associated with that bone. So we can test this using select and deselect. And that's what we want to see. So if we drop out of object mode, if we select the armature, switch into pose mode, select root, press the R key, and nothing happens. It hasn't controlled the mesh, because what we need to do, select the mesh, modifiers, we need to tell Blender that this armature right now it doesn't know what mesh object is supposed to be controlled. So we do that, again select the mesh, by adding an armature modifier. So add modifier, armature, and then here we set the object, selecting from the list, or we can use the eyedropper to select the armature. That will create an association so that if we now select the armature, we're still in pose mode, now press the R key, now the mesh moves with the armature. So if we want to R, Z to lock axis, we now have a hinge rotating around that bone. And that's the basic principle that we then apply to the rest of the mesh. So let's drop out of pose mode into object mode, select our gate, back into edit mode. What we're going to do is set up the handles. So we want to select the handle, select a face, select more. So the shortcut keys for that is Control Numpad plus, Control Numpad minus. So use that if you have access to it. Object data. So we've got two objects that are relatively closely named. So what we can do to make this easier is drop out of edit mode into object mode, select the armature, object data, viewport display, names. That will highlight the bone names so that we can see which bone is associated with which part of the mesh. So names, object data. Right, so select our mesh, back into edit mode, make sure we've got our bits selected, object data, make sure we select the corresponding vertex group, assign, deselect, select, deselect. And we need to be careful here because we assigned everything to hinge, so hinge still has control over this section of the mesh. So what we can do here is select handle, select hinge, and then remove, and that will remove. So if we then select none, we should find that if we click on the hinge group and select it, that group should not select this loop. And it doesn't, it selects everything else. So this is how we can control our vertex group assignments. So even though we had hinge assigned to everything, we can assign another group to another section of the mesh and use that to select that item and then remove the bit that we want to remove, or the group that we want to remove. So we can do that on both sides, but we'll deal with this for the moment because we need to check now. So deselect, handle 1, select, and that should only select handle 1, and it does. So we can drop out of edit mode into object mode, select the armature, object mode, pose mode, select the bone, press the R key, and that rotates that section of the mesh only. So repeat the process on the other side. So mesh, edit mode, select the section of the mesh, just make sure that nothing is selected, so deselect all, so select none. Select, shortcut key, Control numpad plus. This is handle 2. So handle 2. Select, assign, deselect, and again hinge, select. That selects everything, which we want to avoid. So deselect, select our handle, select, highlight, hinge, and then remove. So that now means that we can't use the select and deselect buttons on that group now, at least on this part of the mesh. So it'll select all of it. So this is what we want to use. How we double check our assignments. So now only handle 2 will select and deselect that vertex group. So again, if we exit edit mode, object mode, select the armature pose mode, so then press the R key, and that manipulates the handle. So that's the 2 handles done. What we want to do now is sort out the spindle or the axle, because we want that to move these knobs, but the way that the mesh has been set up, it's going to twist this section of the mesh because they're joined together. So we'll need to fix that. So object mode, so select the mesh. Let's just hide the armature for the moment so that we can see what we're doing. So select, we'll use the outliner, click on the eye icon, that just hides it. So mesh, edit mode. So what we want to do here is select this top part, the ball of the doorknob. So we can do this in various ways. So Alt click to select the loops, and then Shift Alt click, then click the remaining faces that we need to select. So if we press the G key, see that is attached, so it moves. So we can address that, mesh, split, selection. And what this will do is it'll split this section of the mesh away from this section of the mesh so that it moves independently. So split, selection. So if we move it now, it moves independently. So what we need to do here is let's just move this to one side. So hold Control so that we snap to the grid. What we want to do is just fill this gap that we've created, because if we animate this without doing that, we might inadvertently cause artifacts where gaps appear as the object is rotating around this non-cylindrical shape. So we won't see it from the underside of the doorknob because we can't see this way. We can see this way as we are looking at our object, but we can't see from behind it. So we don't need to worry about this being open per se, but Depending on the game engine that this is going to be used in, we might need to sort that out so that the mesh is closed. And what that means is that we have to fill. So I'm just going to go into Edge Select. We have to fill any open surfaces. So Loop Select, Alt Click, Vertex, New Face from Vertices. Same for the other side. Select, so that's Alt Click, Vertex, New Face Edge from Vertices. That'll fill that. Do the same thing on the other side whilst we're at it. So Face Select, Alt Click, Shift Alt Click, and then Shift Click. Mesh, Split, Selection. Move that to one side so that we have clear access. Edge Select, Loop Select, so Alt Click, Vertex, Alt Click, Vertex, New Face. So what we can then do is just, whilst we've got that selected, we can just use Control plus, move that back into position, like so. Control plus, move that back into position. So that will now mean that that will rotate without affecting the plate at the back. So whilst we're here, what we can do, whilst that's selected, we can assign the axle group to that section of the mesh. So select it, assign. Remember, we have to remove hinge. So select hinge and remove. So that should mean that axle only selects that section. The hinge omits that section from that selection. Repeat again. Control plus. So this is the same group because it's the same bone that controls both sides, because the door handle acts in unison on both sides. So axle, assign, hinge, remove. So axle, deselect. Let's just move into a position where we can see both sides. Select, deselect, hinge, select, deselect. And because we've done that, if we now unhide the armature, edit mode, object mode, select the armature, pose mode. If we select the axle bone and rotate that, obviously we're a bit skew with, but we can see that those parts of the mesh follow the axle. So as mentioned, we've got, let's just, whilst we've got the armature selected, in Object Data Properties we can enable in front. And what this does, it'll turn on essentially X-ray for the armature so that we can select the bones through the mesh. So that's the hinge. Press the R key, lock the Z axis, and then we can rotate the door like so. Select the axle, press the R key, and this is going to be the X-axis, no, Y-axis. And that rotates around that. We might need to make some adjustments to the position of that, but we'll sort that out. And then R, rotate Y to lock the axis, or rotate X, which is what we actually want, Same again on the other side. Select RX. And that rotates the handle. So, as we've got the armature selected, we want to go into edit mode. And we need to carefully position the axle bone so that it rotates around the center. And that might mean making adjustments depending on how the mesh has been constructed. That might not necessarily mean that we have a linear alignment between bone and mesh, that we might have to offset it slightly relative to the head and tail. So we can select the head and move that off kilter somewhere just so that it rotates. But select view, viewpoint, viewpoint front. Let's switch into wireframe. As we can see, it's slightly offset. So this side is centered. And this side isn't. And of course, because this is one of the reasons why we want to try and avoid bones extruded from the head end of the bone, because they're not linked, they're not connected. So what we're going to do here is make sure that we have the head of the axle selected and then shift click the bone so that we move that as a unit. Alternatively, we would just move the mesh section so that that was centered. So if we test this now, pose mode, rotate, y-axis, it works okay on that side. It's off kilter on that side. So in these situations, this is where we might need to adjust the mesh to compensate, or we might need to add more bones, which complicates the rig and the animation process. So there's options in terms of what we can do. The easiest thing is to maintain the simplicity of the armature. Let's select that bone. Let's go into top view. The easiest thing to do is keep the simplicity of the armature. Align that. Let's quickly go into wireframe so that we can see the bones. Just use the widgets to select the top and tail and move those into position so they are aligned to one another. So that side's the OK side, it's this side. Right, so object mode, select the mesh, edit mode. So we need to select all the components. So shift click, use control, numpad plus, and then we can move that into position. So front view, and then wireframe mode again. Align the meshes like so. So now, if we go back into object mode, select the armature. So there's a bit of back and forth in terms of checking. So this is R key. There we go. That's fixed that little niggly problem. So we had to do two things to the mesh, and this is, generally speaking, what will happen. To keep the rig skeleton, the control skeleton, as simple as possible, we've had to make some adjustments to the door handles, the knockers, so that they are lined up to keep this control system as simple as possible, because we don't want to start adding extra bones that can be done with one bone. If we can do it with one bone, just stick with one bone. Don't start adding bones to the armature just to try and compensate for something. If we can adjust the mesh to align with another section of the mesh that's being controlled by this one bone. So if we can do that, do it. And it doesn't harm the mesh in any way. So that is our basic rig. See, we're in pose mode. Remember that we have to be in pose mode, so select. So we're rotating around the pivots or the hinges of the mesh, and then we're rotating around the axle of the handles, and then the pivot point, because again the handles obviously go through the knob at the end there, so that is the pivot point. So that is our rig. So let's save this. File, save as 12. So the next part, we're going to animate. We're just going to create a simple animation. So for clarity, we're just going to remain in the layout workspace, but we're going to change the timeline at the bottom here. So we're going to switch from timeline, we're going to switch to the dope sheet, and then from the dope sheet we're going to switch to the action editor, because what we're going to do is work with keyframes. Just going to expand this, so mouse over the border to get the double-headed arrows, just click drag, make this a little larger. So what we're going to do is use keyframes and just do a simple rotational animation. So we're going to lock the position as a pose, essentially, and that will drop a keyframe into the timeline, and we'll have several of them depending on what the animation does. So we're just going to do a simple open sequence, and that will drop in a series of keyframes. And because it's a sequence, so it's going to be 60 frames, 120 frames, however many seconds long it will be, we'll have keyframe markers at various points that lock in a bone's position location. So it's pose, essentially. So what we need to do first is select all the bones and set a base pose. So timeline scrubber is at frame 1, so we can click drag that, and we're just going to insert pose, animation, insert keyframe. So pose, animation, insert keyframe. We want location and rotation. So that drops in keyframes for each of our bones. So let's just expand the summary. So if we click on the little arrow, that'll expand the summary so that we can see all the individual elements. So again, a simple pose. So we've got our base frame. Let's go to frame 60. Select our hinge. We're going to use the rotate widget. Just going to rotate that 95 degrees. So we're holding control to snap to the increments, and that's 5 degrees snapping. Release, pose, animation, insert keyframe, location, rotation. So if we click drag the scrubber, that is our open sequence. And that is a very simple animation. So let's just rename this open. Now, depending on where this is going to be used, this might be the animation for open. We might then need to create a second animation sequence for the close, which would be the inverse of this sequence. Alternatively, what we can do, back to frame 1, make sure our bone is selected, pose, copy pose, copied, move the scrubber to frame 120, and then what we can do is pose, paste pose, that's pasted the position. We now need to insert animation, insert keyframe, location rotation. That locks the position pose into the timeline. So we've now got a full open close. So again, depending on where this is being used, we can either do it this way, where both the open and close is part of the same sequence. Then within the engine tech, the start and end frames are set, so it pulls in different actions from the same sequence, or you would have to create a new sequence. So if we had to create a new sequence, what we would do is click on the file icon. That duplicates this sequence, so let's call this click type close. We then need to select all the markers at frame 1, delete them, and then move this to frame 1. So let's just select all the bones, because remember that we set a base pose for all the bones. So at the moment, if we just delete this, all we're doing is deleting the pose that's associated with that bone on its own. So select all. So Alt click, that loop selects essentially that keyframe. We can now delete those. So key, delete keyframes, delete keyframes. We want to select, so control click drag. That draws a selection loop, so control click drag. Then what we can do is press the G key and move our keyframes into position. They automatically snap to the grid. So if we now go to frame 1, the door is open, and now it closes. So that's your close sequence, and that would be a separate action. So we have open. So if we just remove this at the back here, so Alt click, delete, delete keyframes, delete keyframes. So this would be our open. It stops there, and then we have our close, and at frame 1 it's open and it closes. So that's two very simple sequences. So we've got a choice of either dropping all the actions into the same sequence or creating a separate sequence for the different actions. Whether we do one or the other will depend on the game engine that's being used. So let's save this file, save as, just call this 12B. And that's a very basic animation for our gate. So of course, if we wanted this to be more complicated, so for example, select the axle and move the scrubber. So we want frame 15, frame 10, frame 20. Let's say frame 20. So what we want to do is copy that bone, pose, copy pose, move to frame 20, pose, paste pose, insert keyframe, location rotation. So that will fix the bone in place for 20 frames. What we can do here is at frame 10, let's rotate, just double check that we're using the rotate widget, the axle for the handles, insert keyframe, and rotate. So we want this to be local rotation. Right now it's global, so we want to rotate this relative to the bone itself. So we change the transform orientation from global to local. Watch what the widget does. It'll realign itself like so. So now we can pose the handle clapper and move it, manipulate it relative to its own axes. Insert, location rotation. So we've got the handle being pulled outwards and the axle rotated or twisted as though to open the door, and then back to the reset. So we're going to copy the pose from axle, pose, copy pose, at frame 20, pose, paste pose, insert keyframe, and the same again for the handle. Pose, copy pose, pose, paste pose, animation, insert keyframe. So what we have is the handle moving and then the door opening. And of course we can change the timing by moving individual frames. So if we wanted the handle moving and lifting quicker or slower, we can increase the duration by moving individual frames further along the timeline to slow down or speed up certain actions. So let's say, so we're selecting the axle, let's move the axle, so press the G key. Let's make the axle move slowly. See how that changes the characteristics of the sequence. So if we undo that, edit, undo, edit, undo. So that's before, an even distribution between the keyframes, and that's after. So there's a slightly quicker return or snapback of the action. So this is essentially a secondary animation. So what that does is, because it's changed the time between the start and the end, or the loop, it changes the way that that behaves, which then gives the impression that, is this heavy metal? And again, if we wanted, so we've got the handle moving and then the door moves. So what we could do, select the hinge, let's select that, press the G key, Let's move that to frame 10. So what does that do? So the handle, it starts to move the door before the handle finishes. Which again changes the behavior, the characteristics of the animation. So of course, because of the simplicity of this rig, even though it is simple, we've got an incredible amount of flexibility in terms of how the action plays simply by changing the timing or the position of individual keyframes within the sequence. So let's say we'll move the handle keyframe here. That shortens the timing, so that doesn't work quite so well. So let's move that all the way up there. So that changes the behavior of the handle. Even though it's a difference of a couple of frames, it makes a difference. So that is rigging. Let's go into of course we need to do it to both sides of the door, but that is an animated asset, a door that rotates around a hinge. So just as a summary, as mentioned, the mesh is set up so that it pivots around the origin point of the object. So that's crucial. So the animation will only, or should only, rotate relative to that pivot point. So this door or gate will only rotate towards the viewer, towards the camera as we're looking at it. We then made some adjustments to the mesh to fit the armature so that we keep the armature as simple as possible, so that we're not adding extra bones that make things more complicated. We've then obviously linked everything up with vertex groups or corresponding vertex groups to the different parts of the mesh to the corresponding bone. And then once we've got all of that set up, we just select our bones and we create our simple sequences. So there is one quick thing before we exit this tutorial. If we go back into the timeline, so we're clicking on the editor type button, go back to the timeline. Timeline has these play buttons. If we click this button, we activate auto insert. What we can then do is just animate the sequence without having to constantly insert keyframe. This will insert whatever data type we are working with. So if we go back to dope sheet, the action editor will be active. We should find, so let's just do a quick insert. So let's just move this arbitrarily. It automatically drops in a keyframe for us. So we could set that up before we started in the timeline, just the auto keying, and that avoids having to constantly manually insert the keyframe. But that is rigging and animating a simple game asset.